The morning fog had not yet lifted over Redstone Creek when a woman in a faded gray coat pushed open the door of a roadside diner and asked for a table near the window. She ordered black coffee, 2 eggs, and a slice of toast, speaking softly, almost invisibly, the way people do when they want to be forgotten. Nobody in that diner knew her name. Nobody knew that the quiet woman eating breakfast alone was the newly appointed director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, traveling under no title, no badge in sight, only a notebook tucked beside her plate. Minutes later, the most powerful man in town walked through that same door, glanced at her once, and decided without a single question that she looked like trouble. Before the eyes of dozens of stunned customers, he snapped handcuffs around her wrists in the middle of the diner, smiling as if he had just saved the town from something terrible. He had no idea that the woman he humiliated held more authority than anyone he had ever answered to in his life, and that his own future was about to collapse in front of the very people who once called him a hero. Redstone Creek, Montana, sat quietly at the edge of the mountains, a town so small that everyone recognized everyone else's truck before they recognized the driver. For nearly 20 years, Sheriff Clayton Rohr had been the loudest voice in that town. His name appeared on plaques. His face smiled from the front page of the local paper every autumn. His word was treated less like law enforcement and more like law itself. People trusted him the way people trust a habit, without asking questions. He called it order. Others quietly called it something else, though few dared say so out loud. On that particular morning, none of that history mattered yet, because a stranger's SUV had rolled into town before sunrise, and nobody had noticed her arrive. Nyla Monroe was 45 years old, sharp-eyed, unhurried, the kind of woman who noticed exits before she noticed decor. She had been sworn in as director only weeks earlier, and instead of settling behind a desk in Washington, she had chosen to travel unannounced through small towns where complaints about local law enforcement had piled up for years without consequence. She dressed plainly on purpose. No tailored suit, no government vehicle, just a rented car and a worn coat. She wanted to see towns the way ordinary people saw them, not the way officials performed for cameras. Redstone Creek was simply the next stop on a list that had grown far too long, updated every time another complaint reached her desk unanswered. She studied the town from behind the wheel on the drive-in, the boarded storefront near the gas station, the single blinking traffic light, the church sign still advertising a bake sale that had clearly already happened. Small towns told their stories in details like these before anyone opened their mouth to speak. Her office had already compiled a thin but troubling file on the county, a handful of anonymous letters, 2 unresolved civil complaints filed years apart, and a pattern noted almost in passing by an analyst. One county consistently detaining more people per capita than any comparable town its size, with almost no cases ever reaching a courtroom. None of it was conclusive alone. Together, it justified a quiet, unannounced visit, the kind that relied on patience and a willingness to sit still long enough for the truth to introduce itself. She had learned that the most revealing moments rarely happened in interviews or press conferences. They happened in diners, in waiting rooms, in the small unscripted seconds when officials believed no one important was watching. That was why she carried no visible credentials, nothing that might alter the behavior of the people she'd come to observe. She wanted Redstone Creek exactly as it was, not the polished version it might offer a known federal visitor. Inside, a handful of regulars sat scattered across the booths, trading small talk about weather and football, the comfortable noise of a town that believed nothing ever truly went wrong there. Grace Holloway, the owner, moved between tables with a coffee pot in hand, greeting each customer by name, the way she had done for over 20 years. When Nyla stepped inside, Grace pointed toward an open booth near the window, treating her exactly the way she treated every stranger passing through. Plain, unthinking hospitality that asked no questions. Nyla sat down, ordered quietly, and pulled out a small notebook, the kind investigators use out of habit rather than necessity. She wrote nothing dramatic, only observations, the pace of the town, the way people spoke to each other, the small signs that told her more than any official report ever could. She watched farmers in worn jackets, a young mechanic still smelling faintly of motor oil, an elderly couple splitting a single plate of pancakes without needing 2 forks. She noticed how the room shifted, almost imperceptibly, Whenever a police vehicle rolled past outside, shoulders straightening, voices dropping half a register. Small details, but exactly what she had been trained to catch. Then the door swung open harder than it needed to, and Sheriff Clayton Rohr stepped inside, filling the doorway the way he filled every room he entered, chest forward, eyes already scanning for something to correct. He was 52, built like a man who still believed intimidation was a form of leadership, long since past distinguishing between authority and entitlement. His gaze moved across the diner out of habit, cataloging familiar faces, until it landed on Nyla, a black woman he did not know, sitting alone, writing quietly in a notebook. Something in him tightened immediately, the way it always did when the familiar picture of his town included someone unfamiliar. He didn't approach right away, instead standing near the counter, watching her the way a man watches something he's already decided is suspicious. Grace noticed the shift and felt a small twist of unease, though she said nothing. Saying something to Clayton Rohr had never once changed his mind. Deputy Mason Pike, 31, trailed in behind him, carrying the quiet discomfort of someone who had learned to read his boss's mood before it fully formed. The easy, ordinary room began to tighten, without anyone quite understanding why. Clayton finally crossed the floor, boots striking the tile with unnecessary weight, and stopped beside Nyla's table. He didn't introduce himself, didn't ask permission. He simply planted himself there, arms crossed, studying her the way he studied every stranger who did not immediately explain their presence to his satisfaction. Nyla looked up calmly, unbothered, fork still resting against her plate. Around them, conversation slowly died, replaced by the particular silence of a room sensing something is about to happen and deciding it's safer to watch than to speak. Clayton's voice, when it came, carried the practiced authority of a man who expected no resistance. He demanded identification, not a request, an order dressed up as one. Nyla set down her fork, met his eyes without flinching, and asked evenly what exactly gave him the legal basis to demand it. The question landed harder than she intended, not because it was aggressive, but because nobody in that diner had ever heard anyone speak to Sheriff Rohr that way. The room seemed to hold its breath. Clayton's jaw tightened. He fired off questions quickly. Why she was in town, who she'd come to see, where she was staying. The way a man fires questions when he wants answers to arrive faster than thought. Nyla answered each one with the same unhurried calm, giving him nothing false, but nothing more than necessary either, careful not to reveal the one detail that would end the confrontation instantly. She wasn't there to end it instantly. She was there to watch exactly how far it would go, the way a physician watches a fever run its course before choosing when to intervene. Her steadiness seemed to irritate him more than any hesitation could have. Clayton had built his reputation on reading people fast, trusting his gut over paperwork, and her composure didn't fit the story he'd already begun telling himself. He muttered that innocent people answered questions fast. That hesitation was its own kind of confession, ignoring that Nyla had hesitated at nothing at all. A few longtime admirers of the sheriff nodded along under their breath, the quiet agreement of people who'd spent years assuming his instincts were always right, because questioning him had always felt like more trouble than it was worth. Grace stepped closer, setting down the coffee pot, gently reminding Clayton that the woman had done nothing but order breakfast like everyone else in the room. He waved her off without even looking at her, the way he waved off anything that didn't confirm what he'd already decided. Deputy Mason shifted his weight near the counter, a small uneasy voice in the back of his mind whispering that something about this didn't sit right, though he said nothing out loud, the way he'd said nothing out loud so many times before. Nyla asked once more, calmly, precisely, what legal grounds justified an interrogation over breakfast. It wasn't defiance. It was a simple, exact question, the kind that exposed the absence of any real justification the moment it was spoken aloud. Clayton had no clean answer, and the lack of one, rather than giving him pause, seemed to inflame him further, as though her calm control were itself the offense. His hand moved toward his belt. He announced, loud enough for the whole room, that he had every right to search her, that suspicious behavior was justification enough in his town, and that he intended to find out exactly who she was one way or another. Nyla didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand. She simply looked at him, steady and unblinking. and said he was making a mistake he wouldn't be able to undo. Clayton laughed, short and humorless. The laugh of a man who had never once believed the word mistake could apply to him after 20 years of a town cheering every decision he ever made. An older man 2 booths away, a retired mechanic who'd known Clayton since childhood, cleared his throat and suggested quietly that maybe the sheriff should let the woman finish her breakfast in peace. Clayton shot him a look sharp enough to end the suggestion, and the man decided the matter wasn't worth pressing further. A small moment, but Nyla caught it, filed it away with everything else. She asked him plainly whether he intended to detain her without any charge, without any warrant, based on nothing more than the fact that she was a stranger he didn't recognize. Clayton's silence answered more clearly than words could have. He straightened instead of answering, reaching for the cuffs clipped at his belt, the gesture itself a kind of confession that no legal justification existed and none was coming. The cuffs came out fast, the metallic click echoing unnaturally loud against the quiet clatter of dishes. Clayton pulled her hands behind her back with more force than the moment required, snapping the cuffs shut with the satisfaction of a man closing a case he'd already decided was solved before it began. Several customers pulled out their phones instinctively, recording without fully understanding why. The way people record anything that feels wrong but unstoppable, letting the phone do the objecting for them. Clayton straightened, chest puffed, and announced to the room that this was exactly why Redstone Creek stayed safe, that a sheriff who trusted his instincts was worth more than 100 pages of procedure. Nobody cheered, though a few offered small, uncertain nods, the kind people give when they've spent years trusting a man's authority more than their own judgment. Nyla said nothing. She didn't resist, didn't raise her voice, didn't struggle against the cuffs biting into her wrists. She simply watched him, memorizing every word, every gesture, every face in that room that chose silence over intervention. Grace stood frozen behind the counter, hand pressed to her mouth, disbelief and anger fighting for space behind her eyes, torn between the urge to shout and the fear of making things worse for a woman she'd known for less than 20 minutes. Deputy Mason took a half step forward, some instinct telling him to intervene, but years of habit, years of deferring to Clayton's judgment without question, held him rooted in place. Clayton gripped Nyla's arm and guided her toward the door, narrating his own heroism to no one in particular, as though the silence of the room were agreement rather than shock. The bell above the door rang once as they stepped outside into the cold morning air, Nyla's expression unreadable, calm in a way that unsettled anyone paying close attention. Outside, the town looked exactly as it had an hour earlier. Quiet streets, parked trucks, a flag hanging still in the windless morning. Clayton walked her toward his patrol car, still talking, still congratulating himself, oblivious to the sound gathering behind him. Low at first, then unmistakable, the deep hum of engines approaching from beyond the edge of town. Deputy Mason, a few steps behind, was the first to notice the shapes emerging through the thinning fog, 3 black SUVs moving in careful formation, government plates catching the early light as they turned onto Main Street. The vehicles rolled to a stop directly in front of the diner, doors opening in near-perfect unison, revealing agents in dark suits moving with the practiced efficiency of people who did this every day. Clayton froze mid-sentence, hand still resting on Nyla's arm, as one agent stepped forward and asked, in a voice utterly devoid of small talk, where they could find Director Monroe. For a moment Clayton misunderstood entirely, some part of him assuming this must be reinforcement arriving to validate the arrest he'd just made with such pride, perhaps even to congratulate him. He straightened his shoulders and announced with unmistakable satisfaction that he had just apprehended a suspicious individual inside the diner, gesturing toward Nyla, still standing beside him in handcuffs. The lead agent's eyes moved slowly from Clayton's face down to the cuffs and back up, professional blankness cracking into visible disbelief. Deputy Mason, watching closely, felt his stomach drop, a cold understanding forming before anyone said a confirming word. The agent stepped closer and said, low and precise, that the woman in handcuffs was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and that Clayton had just arrested her without cause, without identification, and without a single legal justification anyone could name. The words landed like a physical blow. Clayton's mouth opened, then closed, his earlier confidence draining visibly from his face. He laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, insisting it had to be some kind of mistake, refusing to accept that the quiet woman he'd humiliated in front of an entire diner could possibly hold that much authority. The agent didn't argue. He simply dialed a number and held the phone out toward Clayton, a voice from Washington confirming, in clipped, unmistakable terms, exactly who Nyla Monroe was and exactly how serious the situation had become. Clayton's face went pale, and for the first time in years, he had absolutely nothing to say. Mayor Helen Cross arrived minutes later, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she took in the federal vehicles, the agents, the handcuffs still locked around the wrists of the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country. Grace watched the man she'd known for 2 decades unravel in real time. Deputy Mason felt the ground beneath his understanding of the town shift all at once. A small crowd gathered, drawn by the unfamiliar sight of federal vehicles on Main Street, something Redstone Creek had never once seen. The earlier nervous laughter gave way to a heavy, uncertain quiet. Nyla finally spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle, instructing the agents to leave the handcuffs exactly as they were for a moment longer. The order confused everyone present, including her own team, who deferred to her without question. She turned to Clayton and told him this wasn't about her comfort or dignity, but about something far larger. Everything since she'd walked into that diner had been a test, not of him specifically, but of the entire system he represented, a system that had received complaint after complaint from towns just like this one, complaints that rarely reached anyone with power to act on them. She wanted to see how a sheriff treated a stranger he assumed had no power. She wanted to see how a deputy behaved when he sensed something wrong but said nothing. She wanted to see how an entire room of witnesses responded when injustice unfolded in plain sight, whether they intervened or simply reached for their phones and let the footage substitute for their own courage. She noted the camera above the diner's door and Clayton's own body camera, still recording, and ordered all footage secured immediately, nothing deleted, nothing edited, nothing quietly lost the way inconvenient evidence so often disappears in towns accustomed to protecting their own. Mayor Cross tried to offer something close to an apology, but Nyla raised a hand gently, silencing her without harshness. This wasn't the moment for apologies, but for facts, and facts required documentation, not sentiment. She instructed her team to begin securing Clayton's office immediately. Every file, every record, every piece of paperwork connected to his years of service, treated not as punishment, but as procedure. The very procedure Clayton himself had ignored for far too long, without a single person in a position to stop him. By mid-morning, agents moved through the sheriff's office with quiet efficiency, boxing files, copying hard drives, cataloging evidence under fluorescent lights that had never illuminated so much scrutiny before. What they found painted a picture far darker than a single reckless arrest. Unlawful detentions stretching back years, residents held without charge, property seized without warrants, small business owners pressured into silence rather than risk their livelihoods to a man who treated the badge as personal property. Deputy Mason admitted quietly to a federal investigator that he'd wanted to report some of it before, more than once, but fear had always won. Fear of losing his job, of being labeled disloyal in a town too small to offer second chances. Nobody judged him harshly. Instead, they asked him to help now. And for the first time in years, Mason felt the strange relief of choosing courage over comfort. Grace arrived at the temporary federal office that afternoon carrying a small folder of her own, receipts, notes, and dates she'd quietly kept whenever something about Clayton's behavior struck her as wrong. She'd never known what to do with it. No one in town seemed positioned to challenge him, so she'd tucked her observations away in a drawer behind the register, the way other people tuck away regret. Handing it over felt less like betrayal and more like exhaling after holding her breath for years. The investigator assured her that cases like this were rarely built on one dramatic discovery, but on dozens of small contributions exactly like hers, each meaningless alone, devastating together. Word spread through Redstone Creek with unusual speed, carried not by gossip, but by something closer to relief. Business owners who'd quietly paid fines they never understood came forward. Families who'd watched relatives detained without explanation finally spoke openly. An elderly rancher described cattle seized years earlier over an undocumented boundary dispute never returned. A schoolteacher described being pulled over 3 times in a month, each stop ending without a citation, but leaving her shaking behind the wheel. A traveling salesman recalled being detained overnight on no particular suspicion, released with only a warning to drive through town faster next time. Investigators noticed a pattern within the pattern. A disproportionate number of these encounters involved travelers, newcomers, anyone whose face didn't match Clayton's narrow idea of who deserved the benefit of the doubt. A forensic review of the sheriff's discretionary fund revealed thousands in seized cash and property never logged through proper channels. Some never returned even after charges were dropped or never filed. Investigators found handwritten ledgers hidden in a locked drawer, entries matching no official county report, numbers telling their own quiet story of years spent operating outside the law he'd sworn to uphold. The most damning evidence surfaced almost by accident. An old hard drive from a storage closet, containing archive footage nobody had thought to review in years, showing Clayton coercing confessions and manipulating situations to fit conclusions he'd already decided before any investigation began. One recording, nearly 6 years old, showed him calmly pressuring a young man into signing a statement in a holding cell, a confession investigators now understood had been engineered rather than earned. Nyla watched it once, in silence, and asked for it to be preserved exactly as found. Mayor Cross watched portions of the recovered footage in stunned silence, her earlier defensiveness collapsing into something closer to shame. She admitted, in a quiet meeting with investigators, that she'd heard whispers over the years and had dismissed them, choosing to protect the town's image rather than confront an uncomfortable truth. She didn't excuse the choice. She simply acknowledged it, and Nyla, listening, noted that acknowledgement was the necessary first step toward anything resembling repair, though it wouldn't be the last. Under Nyla's direction, an independent investigation was formally opened, separate from local authority entirely. Clayton was suspended immediately, stripped of his badge, his weapon, and every ounce of authority he'd spent decades accumulating. Within days, the man once celebrated on the front page of the local paper had become the subject of a formal criminal inquiry, his name now printed beside words like misconduct and abuse of power rather than hero and protector. Clayton requested a private conversation with Nyla before formal charges were finalized, and she agreed, curious to hear what remained of the man once the authority had been stripped away. They sat in a small, sparse room, the silence heavier than anything spoken in the diner days earlier. He finally asked the question that had haunted him. Why hadn't she simply told him who she was and ended it immediately? Nyla answered without hesitation. If she had announced her title the moment he approached, he would have folded instantly, not out of respect for the law, but out of fear of consequence. And the truth about how he treated ordinary people without power would have stayed hidden. Real authority, she said, didn't need to shout to be recognized. It revealed itself most clearly in the moments no one expected to be watched. Clayton sat with that for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, not quite remorse yet, but the beginning of understanding. He admitted that the moment he saw her, before she said a word, he had already decided who she was and what she deserved, and that decision, made in less than a second, had unraveled everything he thought he'd built over 20 years of service. Nyla told him plainly that he had lost long before the handcuffs. The instant prejudice replaced procedure in his mind. Everything after was simply the slow arrival of a consequence already set in motion. Before the meeting ended, he asked, in a voice smaller than she'd heard all week, how many other officers in how many other towns were making the exact same decision, with no one ever arriving to stop them. Nyla didn't offer comfort, because that wasn't what the question deserved. She told him that was precisely why her office existed. At the door, she added one final thing. Most people who abuse power don't think of themselves as villains. Clayton likely still believed he'd only ever been trying to keep his town safe. The tragedy wasn't that he was cruel by nature, but that he'd never once been required to ask whether his instincts were fair, and by the time anyone did, the damage had reached far beyond a single diner booth. Deputy Mason, informed of the conversation later, agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation, testimony, records, first-hand accounts of patterns he'd witnessed but never challenged. It wasn't an easy choice in a town where loyalty had long been mistaken for silence, but it was finally the right one. He spent 2 full days walking investigators through incidents he'd tried for years to forget, a traffic stop that never should have ended in an arrest, a night he'd lain awake wondering whether he should have said something and never did. By the end, he felt less like a man confessing and more like a man finally exhaling. A community meeting was called days later, the largest gathering Redstone Creek had seen in years. Nyla stood at the front of the room, dressed exactly as she had been that first morning, plain, unassuming, entirely herself. She didn't dwell on her own experience, speaking instead about the fragile difference between power exercised lawfully and power exercised out of habit and unchecked assumption. The law, she reminded them, existed to protect everyone equally, not selectively. She made clear that federal oversight would remain until real, measurable reform took root, not performative promises. She spoke, too, about the people in that diner who had recorded rather than intervened, not to shame them, but to remind them that courage doesn't always require heroics, sometimes only a single sentence at the right moment. An older man near the back asked, voice thick with guilt, how a town rebuilds trust after learning the institution meant to protect it had betrayed it instead. Nyla said trust isn't restored through statements, but through years of small, verifiable decisions made the right way. She announced her office would open a direct channel for residents to report future concerns, independent of local leadership, so no complaint could be quietly filed away again. Clayton was escorted from town under quiet federal custody that same week, facing a growing list of charges tied to years of documented misconduct. Deputy Mason was appointed acting sheriff on an interim basis, met with cautious optimism rather than celebration. The town still adjusting to the idea that authority could be questioned and corrected, not simply obeyed. Grace reopened her diner days later, uncertain whether anyone would return. To her relief, the tables filled again, slowly at first, then steadily. Nyla returned to that diner one final time before leaving town, sliding into the same window booth, ordering the same breakfast. This time, the room shifted immediately, recognition sweeping through customers old and new, and one by one, people rose quietly to their feet. It wasn't deference to her title, but something quieter, an acknowledgement of the composure she'd carried through every moment of humiliation, the steadiness that had exposed a truth the town had avoided facing for years. Grace poured her coffee with hands trembling slightly, not from fear this time, but from something closer to gratitude. An elderly woman 2 tables away whispered to her husband that she wished she'd said something that first morning. Nyla overheard it and offered only a small, understanding nod. It wasn't her place to absolve anyone of their silence. She finished her breakfast, thanked Grace by name, and walked out into a morning far clearer than the fog-covered one that had greeted her on arrival. Within minutes, she was gone, leaving behind a town that would never again mistake a badge for permission. Clayton faced a lengthy federal investigation in the months that followed, the badge he'd once worn with careless pride replaced by a case file thick with documented abuse. Redstone Creek's law enforcement system underwent significant reform. Oversight tightened, procedures rewritten, accountability finally given real teeth. The town slowly understood a lesson it had avoided too long. A badge did not grant power beyond the law, only the responsibility to uphold it faithfully, and silence, however comfortable, was never truly neutral. Mason made a quiet promise that no complaint filed in his office would ever again disappear into a drawer. He began holding open office hours twice a week, listening more than he talked. Slowly, residents began to trust the process again, not because they were told to, but because they watched it work. Grace kept a small photograph behind her counter after that autumn, a quiet reminder of how easily comfort could curdle into complicity if no one paid attention. Nyla Monroe left no farewell speech behind, only the quiet example of a single unhurried morning that had unraveled years of hidden injustice. She moved on to the next town on her list, carrying nothing but a notebook and the same plain gray coat, ready to sit quietly in some other diner, order breakfast, and simply watch. Because true justice, she understood better than most, rarely arrives with noise. It arrives quietly, patiently, and it never answers to a badge worn without conscience.